Perfect. Awesome. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my graduate research, which is in harmful algal blooms in Lake Champlain. And I'm an economist. So what I'm really looking at is how much Vermonters are willing to pay to fund HAB mitigation. And then the idea of sense of place theory and how that relates to HAB mitigation here in the state of Vermont. It's not letting me progress. Here we go. All right, so today I'm going to give a little introduction to who I am and some of the work that's being done at Cairo and the team that I work on. Then sort of give an overarching idea of the problem that we're facing here in Lake Champlain, give a little insight into the first paper that I've written, and then what I'm working on now with my second paper, and then how my research is really applying to the communities within the Lake Champlain Basin. As was just said, I got my Bachelor's of Science in 2023 in Community and International Development. And I am actually part of the first cohort of students doing the accelerated master's program in community development and applied economics. I'm actually living down in the Dominican Republic right now. I've finished all my classes and I'm finishing my thesis, which is relating to a lot of the research that's being done that I'll discuss today. And I'm working as the director of a foundation down here that's doing a lot of marine conservation and education work, which is generally the realm of my studies and my professional history. I worked as a research assistant for the Cooperative Institute of Research to Operations and Hydrology. For those who don't know, it's a consortium that's funded by both NOAA and coordinated through the University of Alabama. It's across a variety of different industries and universities here in the United States. Cairo team in Vermont is centered at the University of Vermont and working in collaboration with the Water Resources Institute. My research relates a lot to one of the core pillars of the UVM Cairo team, which is looking at application of social, economic, and behavioral science and water resources. But I directly am a part of the team that's looking at the advancement and acceleration of community water resource modeling. I don't directly work in the modeling work. My team is using natural sciences and computer sciences to develop a forecast model in order to predict when harmful algal blooms are going to be occurring in Lake Champlain using a variety of indicators. These models not only look at where they're going to be occurring, but when, and then also the intensity of these blooms. My work is more on the social science realm and looking at the expressed need and concern and funding that can be allocated towards these efforts, towards these projects in mitigating the occurrences of these blooms. So a little insight into the problem. For those who don't know, Lake Champlain suffers greatly from harmful algal bloom occurrences. The harmful algae that we have is blue-green algae. It can be harmful to humans and animals and has ecological repercussions. Specifically to humans, we're looking at skin irritation, respiratory issues, a variety of infections and things along those lines. But what we're seeing is that with the escalation of climate change and warming water temperatures and air temperatures, lack of wind, combining with agrofertilizers that are now creating an influx due to the large amount of flooding events that we're having in the area and within the watershed, we're seeing the escalation of these blooms. Because of that, we are seeing an increase in beach closures because these algae are not safe for humans to be swimming in or in contact with. And that's impacting industries, it's impacting communities, it's impacting economies. So again, my research is really looking at more of the econometric side of things and seeing how that is impacting Vermonters. Lake Champlain was seeing a great amount of phosphorus loading, specifically prior to 2015. This blue line here that you'll see on this graph indicates the water quality standard at the time prior to an act that was passed in 2015 known as Act 64. And then that red line shows the true trend line of phosphorus loading in Lake Champlain. So what we were seeing in Lake Champlain is there's large amounts of fertilizers and nutrients that are entering the lake through the watershed. And so Act 64 was passed in 2015 to establish funding to meet a new set of TMDLs, which is known as total maximum daily load of phosphorus within Lake Champlain. Between the fiscal years of 2016 to 2023, there was $420 million allocated through this act and through the Clean Water Fund to allocate funding and money towards these mitigative efforts in an indirect way to address harmful algal bloom mitigation. At the end of the fiscal year 2023, 41.5 metric tons of phosphorus loading was reduced. This is a 20% of the required 418.1 metric tons that's required by the Vermont state loading standards that were put into place through Act 64. The Vermont Treasury has stated that $48.54 million are needed in additional funding in order to finance these projects that are working towards HAB mitigation and cleaner water quality within Lake Champlain. The general scope of my research, I am working with the University of Vermont and through Cairo looking at Vermont. So my research specifically focuses on Vermont. That's not to say that this research couldn't be scaled to the broader Lake Champlain Basin, but specifically that's what I'm focusing on in my work. So I have two different papers. My first paper is now in review. And it's looking at the willingness to pay for mitigating harmful algal blooms in the transboundary Lake Champlain using evidence from a double hurdle model analysis. This, again, sounds very dense in terms of the econometrics, but I really try to break it down to be a bit more palatable to everyone. And then my second paper, which is in progress and I'm working on now, hoping to have in review by February, is looking at the influence of sense of place on predicting Vermont residents' willingness to pay and mitigating harmful algal blooms. So it's an expansion of the previous models that I ran in my first paper. So this idea of willingness to pay is seen throughout ecological economics, and it's looking at the maximum amount an individual is willing to spend to acquire a good or service, or to avoid an undesirable outcome. It is often used in economics and environmental studies to measure the value individuals place on non-market goods, such as clean air or natural resources. So here, I use willingness to pay to investigate an indirect expressed concern towards mitigating these harmful algal blooms that are affecting communities surrounding Lake Champlain. We gathered our data through the Vermonter poll, which is a survey that's given each year to Vermont residents with a variety of demographic questions and other questions from other researchers. But we had a question in there that included a payment scale that basically asked Vermonters through an annual fee that was divided through their water bill and their vehicle registration fees, how much would they be willing to pay in order to fund some of these projects that are being used to mitigate the amount of natural chemicals and fertilizers that are entering Lake Champlain, and in an effort to mitigate the amount of harmful algal blooms that we're experiencing here in Lake Champlain. So we used a payment scale that also had an open-ended element to it so that people could express more than $20 or less than $20. So I used that data to inform my models in both my first paper and my second paper. So as I said, we used data gathered in the Vermonter poll between the years of 2014, 2015, 2020, and 2023. It's really great that we were able to get data prior to the passing of Act 64 and afterwards to kind of give some insight into the implications of how that act passing influenced Vermont residents' expressed willingness to pay. The predictors within my models, within my first paper, is demographic variables. So we were looking at individuals, town residents. We were looking at their political affiliations, their gender, their income, to kind of get an idea of who was willing to pay for funding these projects. Now, my model is kind of two-step. The first step of my model is looking at what Vermonters are willing to pay any money to fund these projects. So expressing a willingness to pay greater than $0. My second hurdle of the model is looking at, for those individuals who did express a willingness to pay for the policy, who's willing to pay greater amounts, who's willing to pay less amounts for these funding of these projects. So it kind of breaks down that way to inform policymakers of who's being impacted, who has greater concern, and where this funding would be coming from. Some overall summary statistics that I was gaining from my model, looking at the average maximum willingness to pay for this policy that would be put in place. The average over the years was $38.48, and that would be divided in half by the water bill and the vehicle registration fees. As you can see here, there was a dip in 2015 when the act was passed. There was quite a bit of controversy in the state of Vermont at this time over the act. So that's why we predict we're seeing this trend in 2015, where there's somewhat of a less concern for this, because I think people were worried about how much money was being put towards mitigating the TMDLs in the state of Vermont. Similarly, we saw a dip in the number of respondents that were expressing a willingness to pay for the policy. We see that dip again in 2015, but it looks like an average of 72.58% of Vermont residents expressed a willingness to pay for this funding of these water projects. And again, we're seeing, as the occurrence of harmful algal blooms increase, the concern and willingness to pay and the number of people who are willing to pay increases congruently. So that first hurdle that I was talking about, we really broke it down into looking at who was more likely to be willing to pay any amount greater than $0 and who was less likely to be willing to pay any amount greater than $0. So basically, who is more likely to not want to fund these projects. The significant results of this first hurdle found that those with higher levels of education and those who affiliate with both the Democratic and Progressive Party were more likely to be allocating funding towards these projects. We found that those who reside in Caledonia, Franklin, Rutland, Washington, and Windham County were less likely to be willing to allocate any funding towards these efforts, the Clean Water Fund efforts. And then also, as age increased by decade, we found that older individuals were less likely to be funding these efforts as well. As we move on to the second model, this is looking at who's willing to pay more for these clean water efforts and then who's willing to pay less. It was found that males with Democratic, Progressive, Independent affiliation, or no political affiliation at all were actually more willing to pay greater amounts for this policy. And then similarly to a variety of ecological economic studies, those with higher levels of income are willing to pay more for efforts such as this. We found that overall, males were less likely to be paying high amounts for these clean water efforts. And then also those who do not identify as male and have no political affiliation were also looking to pay less in order to fund these clean water efforts to mitigate the harmful algal blooms. Overall, the greatest insight that we got from this study was the maximum revenue that could hypothetically be generated by Vermont residents in order to meet that $48 million demand for funding in order to progress these projects and the infrastructure that's being used to mitigate these blooms. The maximum revenue that could hypothetically be generated to fund the remediation of HAB mitigative infrastructure in the state of Vermont, based on our findings, was $18,665,865 per year. So that's an annual rate. Again, this is the maximum that could be found based on our findings. So if there were fees put in place in vehicle registration and water bills, it most likely won't meet this number, but it gives policymakers and those setting those fees and implementing these fees into the dollars that Vermonters are paying to get a general idea of how much funding could be allocated towards this infrastructure and these projects. Right, progressing. My second paper looks at this idea of sense of place theory. So as you saw earlier, there were a lot of counties that did not express a willingness to pay at all for these clean water efforts. And that really allowed us to be get some insight and become curious on this idea of distance and how where Vermont residents reside in the state influences their concern for these algal blooms. And that's going to relate to education, that's going to relate to funding, that's going to relate to who believes that they're being impacted by these blooms. And if you look at the different agrofertilizers that are entering the watershed and are within the Lake Champlain Basin, but are going into the lake and fueling these blooms, they're not from the direct coastline of the lake. They're from all over the state. And so this really provides policymakers with insight on where these mitigative infrastructure and projects need to be taking place, where education needs to be taking place, and who needs to be in part of these conversations when we're trying to meet the state TMDLs. This idea of sense of place theory is the degree to which a place becomes more than just a location. It refers to the emotional bonds and attachments people form with specific places, where those places hold personal meaning and become integral to their identity. Sense of place theory is really split into two pillars. We have objective, which is looking at spatial discounting and proximity to the resource or hazard. So this is looking at the raw distance between where someone resides and this hazard or resource that they're relating to within their environment. What most research has found is that there's oftentimes an inverse relationship between distance and the hazard and the concern that's expressed. So the farther you are away from an algal bloom, hypothetically, based on previous research, the less concern you're going to express for these blooms occurring. The subjective element of sense of place theory is this idea of place attachment and experiential bonds. This can be for an individual, this can be for a community, but it's ultimately the relationship one has with their surrounding environment. So those who may work maybe at a farther distance to the lake, but are within a tourism industry that's being impacted by these algal blooms, distance is not capturing their overall expressed concern for these blooms because they're still being impacted them based on industry, based on occupation, based on environment, based on community and things along those lines. So what we wanted to do within our approach is capture both the objective and subjective element of this theory within our findings. And I'll get more into the idea of Euclidean distance and network distance and how that relates now. So Euclidean distance is the raw distance that we are looking at in miles between town centroids to public water resources along the Lake Champlain coast. Rather than doing the basin, we wanted to look at the coast and areas along Lake Champlain because that is where the blooms are occurring. And the town centroids, again, are just the geographic center of each town within the state of Vermont. In order to capture more of the subjective side of this theory, we're finding network distance. So that's the distance from town post offices within each Vermont town to public water sources on Lake Champlain, and finding that distance along major and minor roadways. The reason this is more subjective is the town post offices historically are found in each Vermont town. And the issue about using town centroids is that it could be placed on the top of a mountain. That's geographic. By using town post offices, what we're doing is we're trying to find population hubs to see realistically where are people living, where are these populations concentrated, and then finding the overall distance and time that's needed along major and minor roadways to get to those public water resources, because this is going to give us a more in-depth insight into how far people are living and residing from Lake Champlain. Using these different distances, we have created 4 models that we are running in relation to and in the same style as the first paper. We're just expanding upon our work. The first model is only looking at Euclidean distance and seeing how that can predict whether a Vermont resident is willing to pay, and if so, how much. The second model is looking at that network distance, that subjective distance, and looking at those same 2 things, willingness to pay, and if so, how much. The third model, we're using that objective Euclidean distance, but we're incorporating those demographic indicators from the first paper to get a greater picture of how far people are living from the lake and how much they're willing to pay, if at all. And then that fourth model, we're using that network distance, so that subjective distance, and looking at realistically, okay, where are people living, and having a little bit more context on the occupations and industries of that town and how much time it takes for them to get to Lake Champlain and those public water resources, and then looking at willingness to pay in collaboration with those demographic indicators from the first paper. Overall, the research applications of this, as I was saying earlier, my team is developing a very complex and very in-depth forecasting model at the moment that's used to predict the occurrence, location, and intensity and duration of these algal blooms. That is not my work. I work on the social science side and economic side of this. And what I'm trying to do is get the econometric analytics for policymakers who are looking to allocate greater funding for these mitigative projects, trying to see how much money could really be gained in order to fund these efforts. I'm also trying to gain data on what populations are being impacted most by these algal blooms through that expressed concern in the willingness to pay variable, and how that's relating to the increasing occurrence and escalation of these blooms over time between 2014 to 2023. We're also looking within that second paper to see what areas are needing the HAB forecasting. We're finding that for areas that are having higher expressed concern for the HAB mitigative efforts, so those who are looking to pay for these clean water projects, they're probably going to be the ones who first need these forecasting models and access to these forecasting models, because the industries or the occupations or the lifestyles that they're living are being impacted by the occurrence of these blooms. Thank you. I know I talked a little fast, but please let me know what questions you have. Again, I'm in the progress of that second paper, so we're still really in the early stages of our findings, but let me know if you have any questions.